Okay, welcome everybody. Um, Tonight we are doing the Pennsylvania Society for Ornithology's Education Committee is having a series of events. It's going to continue about every other month. Um, some of our topics, like tonight, will be conservation oriented. Other times it'll be just about the fun of birding and interesting natural history. So there'll be a variety of topics that we're going to bring to you guys over this kind of webinar series. We have a guest tonight, Matt Shumar, who I'll introduce in a second. Um, During the time that he's given his talk, be happy to start populating the chat with any of your questions or any comments towards Pennsylvania Society for Ornithology, anything that you want to put in there. Otherwise, at the end of the talk, people will be able to unmute themselves and just ask questions verbally if you don't want to type it out. So that's the general plan for our agenda. Um, the topic for tonight is Lights Out for Birds, Community Solutions to Avian Conservation. And Matt Shumar is based in the School of Environment and Natural Resources at The Ohio State University, where he's a program coordinator of the Ohio Bird Conservation Initiative, a collaboration of nonprofit groups, businesses, state and federal government agencies advancing avian conservation in Ohio and the region. He was the project coordinator and co-editor of the second Atlas of Breeding Birds in Ohio, and is co-director for the upcoming Ohio Bird Atlas 3. Matthew's research interests include landscape ecology and, in particular, anthropogenic effects on neotropical migrant songbirds. He's also interested in engaging the public into community science efforts and exploring new opportunities for collaborative efforts between academia, agency professionals, and amateur ecologists. Matthew also runs a private research station with a year-round bird banding program in southeastern Ohio with his wife Molly, and is currently serving as president of the Association of Field Ornithologists, an international professional society dedicated to the study of birds and their habitats. So grateful that you'll present for us tonight, Matt. Take it away. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks, Joe, and thanks everyone for coming. Yeah, so I am a Pennsylvania native, so it's great to, even though I'm joining you from Ohio today, it's great to be invited here and talk to you all. I do try to get back when I can, and I'm hoping to come back sometime this breeding season to get some atlasing in, hopefully in central Pennsylvania and around my family's home. So I'll go ahead and share my screen and get started here. All right, everything looking good there, Joe? Okay. All right. So for tonight, I'm going to be talking about a lot of the work that we do more broadly for avian conservation and conservation planning in Ohio. And I'm going to use our Lights Out program as a case study. And I'll get into a lot of the details about it, but I know many of you are probably very familiar with bird building collisions and a lot of the work that's been done in the past few years to mitigate some of those issues. And I also want to talk about more some conceptual things about how we are approaching it and making sure that we are advancing those efforts and continually pushing forward to make our landscape safer for migratory and resident birds. I want to give a quick shout out, and I'll mention her later on, to Devin Mingus-Bruni. We hired her on last year. She's the new statewide coordinator for our collisions program in Ohio. She was unable to join us tonight because there's another program she's getting ready for, but I'll talk more about her in the context of some of the work that we do, and we're excited to have her on board with us now. So I first want to start by giving some background into the organization that I work for, really the program that I work for. So as Joe mentioned, I am the coordinator for the Ohio Bird Conservation Initiative. This is a program. It is a consortium of organizations throughout the state and regionally. If you think about Partners in Flight or the Migratory Bird Joint Ventures, it's a very similar concept, just kind of scaled down to the state level. And we just celebrated 20 years of the Ohio Bird Conservation Initiative last year. and we're on our 20 years of actually having a staff member help to push those efforts forward. So we're one of just a few states throughout the US that have active bird conservation initiatives. And in fact, I had a meeting just last week with Gabe Foley in Maryland and the folks in Wisconsin as well to kind of compare notes about things that we're doing and things that they're doing in those states as well. So there aren't a whole lot of states that have sort of these coordinated efforts. And at least for Ohio, and I know Wisconsin would say the same thing, they've been incredibly important in pushing forward a lot of the conservation efforts that we've done at broader spatial scales and really making sure that folks are working together, and we have a lot of strong coordinated efforts. There are about 120 organizations within our network in Ohio. Many of those are based here in the state, but we do also coordinate with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and Regional Migratory Bird Joint Venture offices. I also sit on the technical board for the Appalachian Mountains Joint Venture, so I'm active with that group as well. And we just have 2 paid staff members. For the longest time, it was 1, but as I mentioned, we were able to get some additional funding to hire Devin on to take the lead on this collision program moving forward. The funding for our work comes from a lot of different sources. In terms of staff funding, that is exclusively through an agreement with the ODNR Division of Wildlife. So similar to the Pennsylvania Game Commission here in Ohio. So they fund my salary and Devin's salary through an agreement that we have in the Terrestrial Wildlife Ecology Lab at Ohio State University. This agreement functions very similarly to a federal fish and wildlife cooperative unit. We don't have a co-op unit in Ohio. I know there's one in Pennsylvania, and I used to work for one in West Virginia. And it's pretty much the same type of agreement, except instead of an agreement with the federal government, it's kind of a state government partnership. So we work on a lot of research and conservation projects that the state is interested in, but may not have capacity to do that. And so on a day-to-day basis, I'm based in the School of Environment and Natural Resources at Ohio State in Columbus. And I'm joining you from home tonight, but normally I have an office on campus. So everything that we do through OBCI kind of goes through a strategic planning process. And I know this seems maybe a little bit dry, but you'll see where I'm tying this in, and it really drives what types of programming and conservation work that we do. So in 2010, we published the first all bird conservation plan for the state. So taking a look at all of the species that occur in Ohio, summarizing threats and conservation needs to try to develop some programming and some work to increase populations of species that are declining, provide habitat on the landscape. And we synthesized a few themes from that effort. One is that we need better coordinated forest management across the state, both on public lands, but for private landowners as well. And we really need to devote a lot more attention to urban landscapes instead of just ignoring them as non-habitats, really understand how they interact with migratory wildlife and resident wildlife, and what we can do in those areas to improve bird populations. And also there was an emphasis on participatory or citizen or community science. And that was that a lot of that work was done around the same time that the second breeding bird atlas was being done. And we've integrated a lot of those results into an updated conservation plan for the state, which we just published almost 2 years ago. So it was similar, except we really got in depth and took a look at a lot of the species in much more granular extent. And we also really wanted to expand that emphasis to broaden it to full annual cycle. So not just look at the breeding periods or what's going on during the winter, but for species that occur at any time during Ohio, even if they're here as transients just for a brief period of time, making sure that we are providing habitats for those species, and especially if Ohio is important for their full annual cycle or during their migratory journeys. This is particularly important if we think about the bird population or the bird population declines that have happened in recent decades. I'm sure you've probably seen a version of this slide dozens, if not hundreds of times by now, but it's really important backdrop into a lot of what we need to do moving forward. So nearly 3 billion birds gone from the North American landscape over the past 50 or so years. Um, we can look at individual taxonomic and ecological groups of birds like forest breeding birds and grassland birds. But if we just take a look at migratory birds, that's the vast majority of that group. So 2.5 billion birds lost in North America since 1970. And so we've, during that time, have put a lot of work into conserving and trying to understand what is happening on the breeding grounds. But clearly there are things happening outside of those time periods and those spatial extents as well. So for the updated all-bird conservation plan for Ohio, we really wanted to make sure we were identifying gaps in knowledge and research needs, but also understanding what we can do in the state in terms of habitat management, in terms of mitigating threats for transient species. And this is a really important one for Ohio. Blackpoll warbler, they're here for just a few days a year. During spring migration, I mean, they have a really concentrated and strong push during the spring. And I think there's typically only about a 10-day period where there's a great chance during the spring to see Blackpoll warbler. But as you can see from this animated map from results from eBird, they're kind of funneling through the Appalachian Mountains, and then when they hit the Great Lakes, spreading throughout boreal Canada. So a lot of this area around the Great Lakes and in this sort of central region of the Appalachians is sort of important for a lot of migratory species. But from some of the work that has been done in the Western Lake Erie Basin, we know that we're getting really large concentrations of Blackpoll warbler, and they're fattening up on some of the dogwood berries that are available in those marshes, heading out to the Atlantic coast during the fall and continuing that migratory journey. So even though this species doesn't breed here, Ohio is pretty important to the successful breeding and continued success of this species across North America. And so it's things like that that sort of begin to drive some of the conservation planning that we're doing. So making sure we're providing habitats, but also looking at threats that this species may encounter during migration. And of course, you know, migration is this incredible ecological phenomenon. We're talking about billions of birds moving across the landscape during spring and fall migration. But really, we could take, you know, as they're moving across this landscape, they're not going, you know, on specific highways. They're really just funneling across the landscape at a coarse scale. And they're hitting any habitat that we can, that they can. And these landscapes, as you've probably observed, in some parts of our states are developing pretty rapidly. So the map that I have here is for Ohio. This is the change in developed lands from 2001 to 2019. And so all of this pink area is land that has been converted from some natural habitat to impervious surface. And so you can see the sprawl that's really happening around the Columbus area. But a lot of this diffuse urbanization and suburban sprawl in northeastern Ohio and Cincinnati as well. And so trying to understand, as we work with city planners, metro park organizations, really understanding how urban spaces are interacting with green space and making sure that we continue to have resources available on the landscape for transient migrants as they're stopping over and refueling so that they can get between Brazil and Canada for overwintering and breeding periods. And of course, you know, for a lot of the birds that we get pretty excited about, I know many of you are probably starting to daydream about them right now as it's cold and colorless. We're excited about tanagers and warblers and all those things, tiny little sprites coming. They're primarily nocturnal migrants, and so they're making these long journeys at night. And as you can see from the map on the right, there is a lot of artificial light at night on the landscape. And so these nocturnal migrant songbirds are navigating across the landscape, and light is part of their navigation. They rely heavily on natural light that occurs on the landscape. And what we've seen is that artificial light can really disrupt those evolutionary migratory cues. And there's been a lot of work on this in recent years, especially in the last few years, showing that at coarse scales and even at fine scales, birds are making stopover decisions based on artificial light on the landscape. And so we are changing the behavior and the stopover ecology of these species by the amounts of artificial light that we're putting on the landscape. And there are a lot of consequences to doing that. And that's what we want to begin to look at through a lot of the conservation work that we're doing. And so we can think about that at different scales. And I'll get back to this later on. We primarily think about light and its impact having a stronger influence more at that macro or regional scale. But it has been shown through research to also have localized site level effects as well. And this is a paper that just came out a couple years ago from Kyle Horton's lab, looking at the multi-scale effects of artificial light and their effects on migratory behavior of songbirds. And this is important. Many of you have probably seen it in your lifetimes. For those of you that are joining us from State College, I know State College looks a lot different than when I was a student there, thinking about the development that has happened in recent years. And there's a lot of light on the landscape. This image is from a paper that from 20 years ago, so it actually includes some predictive modeling that takes us to today. But you can see the amount of light that has changed on the landscape from the 1950s to today. So this, if we compare this to actual light maps that have been created recently, it's pretty similar to what was predicted. So this is pretty dramatic. Some of this is coming from urban and suburban developments, but some of it is also coming from agriculture and natural resource extraction as well. I know some locations here in Western Ohio that have really significant light issues, and they are tomato farms that have greenhouses lit up all night. And so there are lots of things. We're developing the landscapes in interesting and complex ways, and those ultimately will have an effect on migratory wildlife and even resident wildlife. And that plays out in bird building collisions. And there are many things that go into this. I'm going to break it down a little bit and get into some of those. And so there's a couple really important papers here estimating the impact of bird building collisions across North America. So for a long time, we exclusively kind of relied on the Loss et al. Paper from 2014. But very recently, Dan Clem published a paper updating some of those totals. And as expected, the numbers are probably higher and higher than we think. These are based on birds that we find and surveys that are done. So the more information that we get, the sort of more refined these numbers can be. And in some ways, the more depressing they are as well. And this is a field that has really blown up in the last few years. There's a lot of research across North America and globally looking at the effects of artificial light and glass on migratory wildlife. And we're doing some of that here in Ohio as well. And I'll talk about some of the work that we're doing here tonight. So this is really the million-dollar question, and this is really going to be the continued theme of tonight. Really taking a close look at why we do the things that we do. So I'm going to come back to this specific slide later on because it's important that we keep asking ourselves that question. Are the things that we're doing the right steps for the conservation of birds, if that is our goal? And so, yeah, that's going to be sort of the theme, the conceptual theme for this evening. So we sort of couch the work that we do under this lights out umbrella. This is sort of the branding that National Audubon Society has created. It's being used all over North America and in other parts of the world as well. And as I'll get into a little bit later, branding is important, and there are lots and lots of opinions about branding and the ways that things are done. And as a spoiler, I'll get into some of the comparing and contrasting some of these cities, but really there is no one way to do anything, and it varies depending on the sort of socioeconomic and cultural backdrop of the space in which you're working. And so this has been a really interesting lesson in really understanding where you're working and who you're working with. I wanted to become a wildlife biologist because I wasn't really that keen on talking to people all that much. And here I find myself talking to people day in and day out, in really interesting conversations that I never expected to have, all for the conservation of migratory birds. And so we'll get into more of this lights versus glass and branding business throughout the rest of this talk here this evening. But as you can see from the map here, we have programs throughout the state of Ohio. We've essentially created a network of lights out programs with coordinated, focused projects in multiple cities across the state. And so these are the locations that we're working currently. And so here's a great example, the classic example of what a lights out program is supposed to do. So here's the Chicago skyline. This is the OG lights out program in the US. Started this effort in the mid 1990s. And so as you can see, we're not eliminating all of the light from any city. It's really getting rid of all that extraneous and unnecessary lighting. So if you look at the top photo, there's lots of decorative lighting on the tops of these buildings, floodlights shined at the sides of them, and really trying to eliminate as much of that as possible to darken the overall footprint of the city. So the more that you can darken that footprint, the more that you are going to avoid drawing birds into area that they might not otherwise stop over. And so work from the paper that I showed earlier from Jeff Bueller has shown from radar and eBird work that birds are steering towards urban areas away from high quality forested areas because of the artificial lights on the landscape. And the Chicago landscape has been a really important study system for migratory bird collisions. So through our Lights Out programs, there are a number of things that we try to tackle. First and foremost, it is building and business engagement. This is a complex, convoluted process, and it varies from city to city. It is very different working in Cleveland compared to working in Columbus. We have sort of an ex-industrial city with a very different sort of cultural and social backdrop compared to Columbus. So it's been very different working across these cities. And so we tailor our approach based on sort of that local backdrop of what the human dimension needs are in any given area. So we initially start with lighting reduction and management. It's the easy foot in, and I'll talk about that again later. But our ultimate goal is glass treatments for areas that we identify as problematic. A lot of this work comes with local government engagement. In Cleveland, especially, we've been fortunate to have great relationship with both City Council and Cuyahoga County Council as well. So we've done a lot of work with them. They've been huge. To date, that has largely been kind of at the same level as a lot of the private engagement. So it's really just developing an informal relationship with the elected officials. We've not yet started working on legislation. There's a lot of tricky elements to that, but that is something that we're going to be exploring and developing in the coming years. In some of the cities, we're also doing collision surveys, not all of them, and I'll talk about that in a minute as well. And depending on the city that we're working in, we may also have various research projects associated with it. Sometimes there are undergraduate students, we've had graduate students. using the collision data as well, working on a number of projects. And the photograph in the bottom right here was a research project collaborating with Powder Mill. I know Sarah's on the call too. She was collaborating on this project as well at Erie Bird Observatory. So looking at how birds that collide with buildings may have different behaviors post-collision compared to healthy birds. So we have programs in 7 cities currently, and this has really evolved into a broad community science or citizen science effort. We have about 250 volunteers currently that are surveying largely downtown Cleveland and Columbus. And since we've started this, the collision surveys in late 2017, we've salvaged over 25,000 birds as part of those surveys. So we started Lights Out, or Ohio Lights Out, in 2012, just as a small pilot study in Columbus. And so there was a collision study project as part of that. We were working with students at OSU on that. And we found that Columbus was pretty receptive to the idea. We had really good enrollment from businesses in the downtown area during the first couple of years. So we started to work with our partners in other cities throughout the state. First working with Dayton, Toledo, and Cleveland, and we found that whatever we were doing that was easy in Columbus was not going to be easy in Cleveland, Toledo, and even Dayton to some extent, although Dayton was much more similar to Columbus than Cleveland and Toledo. And in fact, Cleveland actually had different branding for the program because local elected officials were very opposed to the Lights Out naming. They really wanted to highlight the nightlife and the lights of the city. And in fact, they're still doing lots of nighttime lighting things in downtown Cleveland, but outside of migratory bird periods. They've been good to work with us on that. And then in 2018, we started programs in other areas of the state as well as collision surveys. So we're have done collision surveys in a number of locations throughout the state of Ohio. So our current monitoring programs are in Columbus, Cleveland, Akron, and Toledo. And I'm really only going to get into some details about Columbus and Cleveland. Toledo's just getting started. They've been kind of in pilot or beta testing mode for the last year or two. And Akron has a very small crew. For those of you who have been to Akron, it's a pretty dark town and there's not a lot of glass in it. There's just one building actually that's problematic and it's on the university campus in Akron. And we've been working with the University of Akron on that project and hopefully we get some treatment there, but there are not a whole lot of problems in Akron as far as this subject is concerned. So the why we monitor, and this is important because when we talk about these programs, especially with partners in other cities and states that they want to jump headfirst into this because it sounds exciting, and this is what you need to do as part of these Lights Out programs. But they are a lot of work, they're complex, and we have to continue to ask ourselves, by adding this monitoring program, is it going to advance our conservation efforts? Because that is the goal. So in the cities that we monitor, we do it because there's a lot of opportunity for bird rescue and rehabilitation. This is super important for folks in Cleveland because we get so many birds there. And that was a way that we actually kind of got our foot in the door in Cleveland, was through the rescue and rehabilitation effort. It is a great outreach tool as well, especially if you're in an area where there are lots of volunteers and lots of bird building collisions. They're interacting with the business community downtown Cleveland day in and day out during migration. So there is a lot of outreach opportunity there. It also allows us to identify priority buildings and facades that are getting the highest rates of collision. As far as treatment goes, it can get very expensive, and we do not have an unlimited pot of money that we can continue to pull from. So we constantly have to make the most with what we have. And by identifying where the most problematic areas are, we can treat those first. It also gives us some opportunity for research. Cleveland has been a sort of a spring for that. You know, we get so many birds there that we've been able to do a lot with those data, and we're trying to make the most of a bad situation. But for some of those other cities, it's important also to understand why we don't monitor. In some parts of the state, we actually have progress on mitigation efforts without needing to have a collision monitoring program. There are just some areas that are receptive to the idea. They're like, yeah, let's do this. We like it. We don't need any more data. Sometimes there's just lack of local infrastructure or resources for coordination. It takes a lot to run these volunteer collision monitoring programs, especially if we're going to do them correctly. If we're going to have consistent coverage and actually use it for research, it can take a lot of resources. In cities where we're not finding a lot, we have issues with low salvage rates, which then in turn feed back into volunteer retention. Volunteers don't want to walk miles on a morning at 5 or 6 a.m. if they're not finding anything. And so for places like Dayton and Cincinnati, we did collision monitoring for a couple of seasons, and then it just sort of fizzled out because they weren't finding much. And so sometimes, we just don't do it. It doesn't make sense for us to do the collision monitoring. Let's take a look at Cleveland for a minute, because that is where we actually get the most of our data. We started collision monitoring surveys in downtown Cleveland in 2017. It was largely unstructured. This was an effort that was sort of spearheaded by folks at the Lake Erie Nature and Science Center. And we sort of fortuitously stumbled in to some good findings and led us to questions that we wanted to start asking, but it was obvious to us that we really needed to bring some structure into the program. So we brought Cleveland Metro Parks on board as a partner in 2021, and they have a huge volunteer program within the Cleveland Metro Parks. It is a huge system. They own a lot of property in multiple counties in the greater Cleveland area, and they've been a great organization to work with. So they actually give us staff as part of this program as in-kind support to help coordinate our volunteer collision monitoring. And that was really helpful. And then 2 years ago, I took a look at all the data that we had collected over that 5-year period, did some rough analyses, and restructured our collision monitoring into a consistent study design so that we could then ask questions about, if we treat a building, what are the before and after? What are those treatment effects? What are the effects of efforts and surveys at particular times of the year? So that we could really ask questions in the same way if we were surveying remote natural areas, parks, nature preserves, forests, the same thing. If we're going to be there, I want to make sure that we can make the most of these data. And so we've really put a lot of effort into overhauling these surveys to make sure that they can answer the questions, which is especially important when legislators and building managers come to us and say, if I put this treatment on my glass, how many fewer birds am I going to get? Or, how bad is it? What is the worst part of my building? And so, by bringing some structure to the study design, we can actually answer those questions quickly. And we're already seeing some of the benefits of that overhaul. So as I mentioned, I did a spatial analysis of our data over that 5-year time period, and we set up some new routes in downtown Cleveland in historically surveyed areas. This is a volunteer program, so it varies day to day and throughout the season about how many we get. Our goal is to have around 12 to 16 people walking around downtown Cleveland every morning. More likely, we usually get around 6 people, but it's been an effort to recruit more volunteers. And depending on how many we have, we sort of adjust how we're doing it so that we're documenting efforts, we're getting consistent coverage on a day-to-day basis so that we can factor out things like season, time of day, that type of stuff. We're also doing a much better job of tracking efforts now as well, which has been really important. Before we had mostly anecdotal information, but now we can actually standardize the data on a given day or a given season to kind of understand, answer some of these questions more specifically. We do things a little bit differently in each city, depending on the extent of the problem, the scale of the volunteer pool that we have, and the local organizations that are involved in the effort. There's probably about an order of magnitude fewer birds collide in downtown Columbus compared to downtown Cleveland. Cleveland is on Lake Erie, so it's a major migratory barrier. It is also a very bright and very pretty city with a lot of green space and a lot of glass in the downtown area. So it's a sort of lot of combination of things that are sort of exacerbating or increasing the number of collisions that we have in that city compared to Columbus. So we can experiment with some things that might be more time consuming or complex to do in Cleveland. So we can try those things out in Columbus. We actually get photo vouchers of every single bird that we find in Columbus. So all of these birds and all of the collision work that we do go to a local museum. There's been overhauls at the Cleveland Museum of Natural History in the last couple of years, so we're actually sending our Cleveland birds to Michigan right now. But in Columbus, the birds that we find go to the OSU Museum of Biological Diversity. But we're also getting photo vouchers of every individual bird as well and building a database of use for that. We coordinate our volunteers through Discord and have a lot of the data collection and communication sort of initially through there, but we're also working on digital data collection tools through things like Survey 123 and some other methods that we can test run in Columbus and refine them as sort of a lower stakes environments before we try to deploy these in a city like downtown Cleveland. And there are some days that are just not fun in downtown Cleveland. We have 250 to 300 bird days, sometimes during the fall. And over the past 5 years, we've collected about 20,000 birds through our volunteer surveys. So it's a bummer, but it also, there's a lot of data there that we've been able to just begin to mine and answer some, take a look at some really interesting questions. And it has resulted in conservation action. Like we've had glass mitigation and lighting management as a result of the birds that we're collecting on these surveys. It's given us really interesting insight as well. So the Cleveland Museum of Natural History had 6 Connecticut warblers in their collection prior to 2017. We collected, I need to update this with the last season, we've gotten a couple more, but I think we're approaching 50 Connecticut warblers in downtown Cleveland since we've been doing these surveys. We had a graduate student at OSU looking at species composition and densities at natural sites in the downtown area compared to our collision data. They were looking at surveys from some of the Cleveland metro parks in downtown. And it is interesting what gets missed because of low detectability. Species like Connecticut warbler, they're probably coming through in much higher numbers than you think, which is probably aggravating some of you birders that really want to see Connecticut warbler. They're there. You just need to go find them. And the collision data has illuminated some of these things. We had a scissor-tailed flycatcher in downtown Cleveland that we got from collision survey. So things show up that we just never expect. We've had a few graduate and undergraduate students working on various projects. And a lot of the data and results have fed into our all bird conservation plan and have gone directly to changes in the next state wildlife action plan. So Ohio is right now in the process of updating their state wildlife action plan. The Ohio Division of Wildlife has been incredibly supportive of this effort. And a lot of the work that we do goes directly into some of their planning and their research needs as well. And really, it comes down to collaborations for this. We would not be able to do what we do if we just sort of tried to tackle this through an individual organization. And so it has really taken a community approach to try to understand some of these issues and address them. And increasingly, a community outside the normal one that we see on a day-to-day operation. So you'll see lots of the expected logos on here: the Ohio Division of Wildlife, Columbus Audubon, Black Swamp Bird Observatory. But if you look closely, you'll see things like FedEx, the Cleveland Cavaliers, it's just private businesses. We're trying to get more and more of those types of organizations involved in really getting buy-in to this work, and it's starting to pay off in dividends. So we need to get back to that question, though. This is something we have to keep asking ourselves. Are the things that we're doing actually fulfilling our conservation goals? I know some of you that are on the call are subscribed to the Collision listserv, and there's always lots of interesting conversations on there about the correct way to do things. We should be focusing on glass or not bothering with the light. But as we've seen from our work, it has been a good strategy to get to glass mitigation if we start with the light. So we're continually assessing the work that we do to make sure that it is propelling us forward and it is actually successful. And this is something we need to keep coming back to and asking ourselves. Is this a sort of adaptive management strategy actually working out? And so I'll bring this up again. We try to tell people that light really sort of is a driver at more landscape levels. You think about, so this photograph is from looking at Cleveland from Lake Erie. This is what birds are seeing as they're coming across. And we have radar data from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service showing birds coming south across Lake Erie and then turning and veering towards downtown Cleveland because of the artificial light. It's then that glass sort of works at that local level or site level. So, and some of the work that Kyle Horton's lab has done has shown that sky glow is one of the most important factors for stopover decisions for migratory birds. And so it's not just collisions. Yes, we really want to work on glass issues there, but there are also increased rates of predation in urban areas. There's lower quality and abundance of food and cover in urban areas. And so lots of things that we do, we want to make sure that we're actually addressing conservation and not just looking at one particular aspect of it. And this approach so far has been working for us, especially in Cleveland, where we've had so many birds. We're starting to see a lot of glass mitigation efforts. So the Cleveland State University has treated a number of buildings on their campus. The photograph in the middle is one of Cuyahoga County's office buildings. And then just recently, the Huntington Convention Center, which is right on the lake, did a major renovation, and they replaced all of the glass with Guardian UV glass. It's really hard to see, but in this bottom photo, you can see it's kind of wavy. When you are perpendicular to the glass, it looks perfect. You can see right through it. But as you sort of get at angles, you can start to see the UV structures that are built into it. So we're getting a lot of remediation work on the glass in downtown Cleveland, and a lot of that comes through our collision surveys and our Lights Out program. This was a big one for us. This is one we had been working on for several years, and treatment actually finished in December for this project. So the Cleveland Cavaliers Stadium, Rocket Mortgage Fieldhouse, it's right on the shore of Lake Erie. It's just a couple blocks off, and it is a glass cube that perfectly reflects the skyline. I'm sure that was the architect's intent for this building. It's quite stunning. But as you can imagine, it's really problematic for migratory birds. And you can go there on a busy, or you could anyway, go there on a busy fall day, stand at the base of that building and get rained on by birds as they hit that structure. The Cleveland Cavaliers have been great partners to work with. This entire facade that you see here has been covered with Bird Divert. It's a UV product that Feather Friendly has acquired in the last year or two. So it's barely visible to the human eye, but most birds have a much broader visible spectrum than humans. And we'll see. We're going to have the first couple seasons of post-treatment collision data, but we're excited about their partnership. And the Cleveland Cavaliers have been anxious to help us spread the word. They want to be leaders in Cleveland to help convince other people. So we have a webinar and a panel we're working on with the North American Bird Conservation Initiative that have folks from the Cleveland Cavaliers involved with that. And I just got an email yesterday trying to put together a local panel with architects and business owners in downtown Cleveland that will have the Cleveland Cavaliers on it as well. So we're really excited about that work. And for us, this sounds silly, but we've seen where the other approach has been taken and it's backfired. And there was a workshop in Chicago this past summer with folks from all over the US working on collision projects. And almost uniformly, everyone was like, yeah, negative promotion and trying to force people into things has just backfired every time. So we're really trying to catch more flies with honey here. And Lights Out has been an easy foot in the door and a relationship builder. We always want to get to glass efforts, but that is a tough conversation to start with, especially when at Rocket Mortgage Fieldhouse, it cost about $990,000 just to treat that one wall that you saw there. So not cheap. Also, given stability with current political and regulatory backdrops, sometimes the legislative approach is not always the best approach. We are going to be working on those things in the background, but we also want to make sure that we're building community around this effort and that we have buy-in in each city, because when those regulatory things go away, we want to make sure that the people still want to do that work. And so that has been our strategy moving forward. I didn't talk too much about this, but this is an issue everywhere. And in fact, most collisions happen outside of urban areas, in residential areas. This is a photo of my home and my windows. So I do practice what I preach, and I encourage all of you to take a look at the windows at your feeding stations as well. There are lots of inexpensive and easy to apply products that do not inhibit the view of your feeders. This was from a couple years ago when we had an eruption of evening grosbeaks, and I was still able to get pretty fantastic evening grosbeak photos from my sun porch, even with feather friendly applied to the windows. So do look into that. And it needs to be dense, essentially not leaving gaps more than 2 inches wide vertically. Hawk stickers don't really work unless you apply them like this and covering up. And so that's where, these dot patterns can be really effective. Minimal coverage, but they have been very effective. We've got a lot in the works right now. As I mentioned, Devin couldn't join because she's getting ready for another program in Cleveland tomorrow. And we have a statewide coordinators meeting next week. So about 30 representatives from all of these programs will be gathering in Columbus to talk about this work. I've been working with the lead architect at The Ohio State University to update the architectural guidelines so that new buildings at OSU are going to be bird safe. We're installing a few treatments this winter so that they'll be ready for spring. And we're really excited about that. And as I mentioned, we're sort of exploring some digital data collection tools as well. But there's my contact information, best email for this particular project. So jot that down, but if we have some time, I'd be happy to entertain any questions, folks. Stop sharing.
Awesome. Thank you, Matt. Yeah, we definitely have time. And the first thing that I saw in the chat, Judy was wondering if we can get links to the publications. I know that because we have the recording, I can help put that together after the fact if you don't have super handy. But Judy, do you want to add anything?
No, thank you. I'd appreciate that, the list of them, so I'd like to read them.
Will do.
Cool.
Yeah, I'd be happy to share those with you.
We have another question from Sandra. She says, why are birds attracted to the city lights?
That's a great question. We don't know exactly why, but if you think about the color spectrum or the wavelength of city lights, it overlaps pretty much with natural light. It tends to be in that white to amber spectrum. And so we know that birds use celestial light, so stars, solar paths, lunar paths, to help them migrate. So probably not in the exact same way that historic sailors used, but we do know that light is important for navigation purposes. And this one, it disrupts that. If you have lots of artificial light, it disrupts this sort of natural light that's on the landscape. But we know that they're attracted to that as well. Even in tunnel studies, they've shown birds fly towards light sources. And it's probably because it's in that natural light spectrum that we would expect to see in the environment.
And Karen, sort of in the same vein, says, do we know why sky glow is attractive to birds?
Yeah. So there's a lot of complexities there that we could unravel. So one is just light being magnified. As you get more and more light, it sort of lights up, and birds can see it from farther distances. That's one aspect of it. Just the ability for birds to see it at very large spatial scales. The other is that it interacts a lot with atmospheric conditions, especially when you have low cloud ceiling. Light can interact with that, and birds will fly into it and they can't see out of it. You may have heard about the 9/11, the light display in New York City. You can see photos of that and birds just flying into it and getting stuck. They can't see out of it. And so we've had bad collision mornings when there have been low cloud ceiling nights in Cleveland. It just interacts with the atmosphere in ways that it really confuses birds and they can't see well.
Certainly at Penn State, same deal. What brands are available to us for treating our windows at our homes? Kathy asks.
There are a handful of those. Feather Friendly is one that I usually point people towards first. That's the photograph that you saw on my home, and they also make commercial application as well. I think you're actually installing Feather Friendly around Penn State campus in a few locations. So that's one. American Bird Conservancy has a tape. It basically comes on rolls like Scotch tape that you can apply in different patterns. The Acopian bird savers are great. So you can make those yourselves too. It's just paracord that's strung up and dangling every 3 inches across. And those have been shown to be even more effective because of the movement that those paracord can provide. So those are a couple products. Feather Friendly recently acquired Bird Divert. So that's the UV product that I talked about. They also have a home application for that. So most of the DIY, the home treatments are pretty inexpensive. It did not cost much for me to treat my windows. The commercial applications can get a bit more expensive because they are custom built. But I
And
can
those buildings are so big.
Yes. Yeah, but I mean, we're primarily treating to that point, really just the glass that reflects adjacent vegetation. So typically up to around 75 feet, I think is the American Bird Conservancy's recommendation. So for those skyscrapers, we're not we're not installing bird safe glass or treatments all the way up to the top. It's really just those first 2 to 3 floors that are reflecting trees and adjacent green space.
Awesome. Can you say a little bit about the effect of all-night floodlights outside homes, barns, etc., in more rural areas from Liz?
Yeah, they're not great. So they would function a bit differently than concentrated city lights. I think there are lots of reasons to promote dark skies. So for migratory birds, it's just one aspect, but also human health, insect health. There are lots of reasons we should be promoting dark skies. So the effect of lights in rural landscapes has a somewhat different effect, but they can still be detrimental. I would encourage people to switch to things like motion lights and shielded lighting. It's really shielded. We can do a lot by just shielding the lighting and making sure that it's directed down at the surface that you're actually trying to illuminate. Unshielded lighting really exacerbates a lot of these issues. And I'm sure you've seen in some of the rural areas, those lights can be pretty bright, even just a single light. So making sure that they're shielded, and if you can put them on motion activation, that's even one step further.
Mike F asks, does weather play a role in the number of collisions, more on clear nights versus overcast nights, etc.?
That's an interesting question, and it's something a lot of people are looking at, and it does not have an easy answer. Because there's such a strong seasonal effect and also an effective day as well. So we've been, and I know other people are doing this as well. Serena Lau was a graduate student working in Scott Loss's lab in Minneapolis on this. So you have to think about a time series of weather events and how that plays to stopover decisions, how long birds spend in a particular area, which migratory season we're talking about. So birds may be more prone to or adaptable to hang out in stopover areas for longer periods of time in the fall compared to spring. Hormones override everything in the spring, and usually there is not as much of a strong effect on of weather on fallout days or big collision days. But we can see more of that effect in the fall, but it's not always in the ways that in which we would expect. We have to look at, okay, where did these birds come from? What was the weather between here and there? What has it been like in the days preceding that as well? Like, what are their fat loads? Those sorts of things. So it's complex, but I know a lot of people are looking into that, and we've started to look at that as well.
Lee, I guess, has a comment that Jeff from the University of Delaware has a great program that explains the influence of light on migratory birds.
Yeah, Jeff Bueller's work is really great. He's doing a lot of really cool stuff in his lab.
Karen says, do things like using blackout curtains indoors at night have any benefit, or does the glass remain a threat?
So glass is not much of a threat at night. Most of the collisions are happening first thing in the morning. So I should have mentioned this earlier. Light and glass work at different spatial scales, but they also work at different temporal periods as well. So these birds are flying at night. They're attracted to the light to stop over. That sort of puts them in an urban landscape that has lots of glass. It's when the sun comes up and birds are starting to forage heavily and put fat back on that they see reflected green space in the glass. And that's when most of the collisions occur. So collisions can happen all day, but we see concentrations of it happen at first light, essentially, like right around sunrise. So you can, I mean, it would be great. And one of the things that we actually encourage for businesses that have workers in offices late at night or overnight to actually use blackout shades as part of their mitigation strategy.
Awesome. Karen, sorry. Karen also asked, could you place that that email address, the preferred Ohio Bird Conservation one, in the chat?
It's
Cool. So that's at the bottom of the chat, and it looks like lots of people have found the chat, so that's great. Sue says, we treated our home windows with paracord that we hung up by taping it to the frames of our windows with outdoor Gorilla Tape, which happened to match the color of our window frames. It was so easy compared to feather-friendly dots, and they have hung up for over 3 years and are still sticking tightly. I like to watch them move gently in the breeze, and it's fun to see birds land on them at times.
Yeah, that's awesome. I've been encouraging some of the nature centers around Ohio to incorporate that into their programming for kids at camp. They can make these paracord solutions and then take them home, and their parents are kind of forced to hang them up then because they need them.
Cool. Great one, Sue. Judy, I see your hands up. Why don't you go ahead and then we'll
Okay,
take just a couple more after.
thanks. Actually, I have two questions. One is when your lights out program, what hours do you use? We started in Philadelphia, we started at midnight, and then we found things like peregrine falcons hunting the birds between 9 and midnight that are, flying in the light stream. But the problem we've had then is since we started with the businesses at midnight, they've been reluctant to switch to earlier hours.
Yeah,
So,
so that's a really good point, and it's something that comes up continually. So our blanket recommendation, or what we start with, is turn them out all night if you can. If it becomes a question like, can we do this or that? So we have individual conversations with folks. It is most crucial that they are off during the second half of the night when birds would be making stopover decisions. But of course, as you point out, there are issues early as well. So it's a little bit of a give and take. I'm much more interested in working with someone and starting that relationship. And maybe it's not ideal, but it is a starting point. So the initial recommendation is all night, sunset to sunrise. But if you have to leave them on, try not past 11 p.m. or 12 p.m. But really, they need to be off in the few hours prior to sunrise.
my other question is, how did you work on getting community engagement? What did you do to start that with businesses and members of city governments?
Yeah, that varies city to city. I think Cleveland is probably the best example, and it's been what we've been doing. So we put together a small team, and as you can imagine, me as an ecologist just calling a business and saying, can you do this thing, is not all that effective in most cases, especially if the program is just starting out. So what was very effective is that we got a commercial real estate agent on our team. His mother was on the board of the Cleveland Museum of Natural History, so he kind of grew up around wildlife and with a strong interest in conservation. And so he knew lots of people. And so we tried to have those conversations all the time. Like, he worked with a lot of commercial and more white collar clientele on a day-to-day basis. So it was usually who knows who and how many steps do we need to take to get to it. It was, this person plays golf with so-and-so, they're managing this thing. So it was a lot of these sort of behind the curtain conversations that got us there. And so my recommendation always is try to put together a few people who are a little bit more connected in your city. And that commercial real estate agent was one of the most important people that we could have got. I mean, he didn't know much about birds. He liked birds, but he knew people. And he could talk to them, get them somewhat interested, and then kick them over to me. And if they came through him, they were much more interested in talking about this issue than if I just went up, called them, or knocked on their door. And you'd be surprised who was on the board of Audubon chapters and museums. Lots of connected people, and those are good folks to start with.
I'm so amazed by the way that you've built such a huge network. That's so awesome. It's a dream for Pennsylvania.
It's a lot of chess.
Yeah.
And it's tough for the volunteers because they don't see a lot of that, and they get frustrated that birds are still hitting. And as some of these bigger success stories have started to come out in the last year or so, they're finally seeing like everything that's happening. And so you just have to play the game a little bit. It's a people issue, not necessarily a bird thing to figure out.
Last one from Liz. You mentioned the dangers associated with glass that reflects nearby vegetation. What about glass atria? Tons of plants inside. Is that equivalent problem?
It is that we have lots of sites in our cities that are like that, where there's treed atria and even skywalks between buildings. They're equally problematic, but the treatment is a little bit different. So in all cases, we're usually trying to maximize the contrast between the deterrent and the glass or the reflection. So in a lot of the reflected spaces, we actually recommend the white feather-friendly dots because they increase that contrast. In a lot of atria and skywalk areas, we actually switch to recommending a dark dot. It's usually a site-by-site basis. We're looking to see like what are the average lighting conditions, like what is the vegetation. Sometimes very tall buildings around it will change that as well. So always trying to maximize the contrast. But yeah, those vegetated atria and skywalks and other things are just as problematic.
Awesome. Well, I think I can communicate from the crew our gratitude and applause. It's really awesome work and a lot of aspiration from our end to follow your model. Thanks so much for your talk and just for the body of work that builds into it. That's so cool.
Well, thanks for the opportunity and for inviting me. It's always great to see some familiar faces, and it's super exciting to see the successes that you've had there in State College and in some of the other places. So keep up the good work. I want to keep seeing your success stories as well.
Thank you, Matt. Awesome. And thank you everybody who came and attended. And if you have any friends who wanted to see the presentation and didn't get it, you can either contact Brian or I'm also putting my own email address here in the chat if anybody wants to grab it, but you'll see it through the PSO social media. Some of the recording will go up. So thanks a lot.
Thanks, everyone.
Good night.